Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This tape here, we're talking with the Honorable Douglas Dillon, Under Secretary of State for the Eisenhower administration the last 2 years, Secretary of the Treasury 1961 through 65, and later, I believe in the 70s, you came to become the board chairman of the Rockefeller Foundation. You were also a trustee of the foundation in the 1950s and knew my father then.
No. I think I was just a trustee for maybe 2 months.
Oh, really?
In late 1960.
Oh, right at that exciting time.
Right at that exciting time, because John Rockefeller asked me to join the board, which I said I would do because I had fully expected to leave the government at that time, not knowing that what was in store, that I'd be part of the Kennedy administration. And so when that happened, then I had to resign.
I see.
And then I came back on the foundation as soon as I left the government.
I see.
In 65, yeah.
You wouldn't really have known too much about my dad's
just what I
performance
heard.
as president
I
of the
know nothing
foundation.
about that.
Your first contacts with my father would have been when?
Well, the first contact that I had with him was at the fall meeting, I guess, at the Rockefeller Foundation in 1960, which is the only one I went to. I was still in the administration, but supposedly leaving it, and I did attend that meeting, and that was the meeting I wrote you about, where he was called out of it several times.
That was
what was going on, but the negotiations, whatever it takes to finalize a job like that.
That was an exciting meeting for a number of people, and you were one of them.
Yeah, that's right.
Do you have anything further in the way of insights or anecdotes about that particular meeting? Obviously, you knew something was up.
No, that was about all. I just remember it happened. I picture the room there that we were in. Father getting up and having to go out. So John Rockefeller not seeming to have any concern about it, which he would have done under ordinary circumstances. We all knew that something was in it. We didn't know what it was.
Did either you or my father announce the results of that phone call?
No.
Do you the short time that you were with the foundation, and perhaps later in the 70s, as you served over a longer term as chairman of the board, did you come to have an impression of my dad's performance at the Rockefeller Foundation?
I don't think so specifically, except that it was the performance of the foundation during those years was good, and that's as far as I knew. I started back in as a trustee in 65 and became chairman when John Rockefeller retired, which I think was 1970. I was chairman for not very long, 2 or 3 years before I had to retire.
I see. Did he leave any particular stamp or mark on the foundation that you were aware of?
Your father?
Yes.
I wasn't, that wasn't brought to my attention one way or another, because it would have been 5 years earlier, roughly, or 4 years earlier, 5 years earlier, I guess, by the time I actually got back. And so I was more involved with George Farrar, who was...
I remember him, yeah.
He had a strong interest in agricultural policy, because he was an agricultural specialist. And so that's the only thing I really remember.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Secretary of the Treasury, maybe I can have you comment, if you will, on whatever dealings of substance, anything that I might be interested in, as between your two departments, Treasury and State. Did you have much contact with each other?
No, there wasn't much, and I think I can explain that. There was less than there had been in the past. When I was in the State Department, it was much more.
Between state and treasury.
Yeah, and the reason for that was that when George Humphrey became Secretary of the Treasury, he was a very strong individual, and he was close to Eisenhower, and he claimed the right to be interested in anything that had to do with money. He was Mr. Money.
I see.
And so, particularly in the area of negotiations that had to do with foreign aid or policy of that type that might lead to some sort of aid commitment, the Treasury had developed a position where they had to approve every telegram the State Department sent out. And of course, in a big bureaucracy, that was always done way down the line.
Yeah.
It was very nitpicky, and there was lots of fighting between the two organizations, which I was very aware of in the State Department. Secretary Dillon, and after him Secretary Herder, had minimal interest in economic policies, although they recognized their importance, but they both turned that over to me. And so I bore the brunt of this, and often would have to talk with the Secretary of the Treasury, then Bob Anderson, because these rows couldn't be solved. And on more than one occasion, quite a few occasions, we had to go to the President together and have President Eisenhower arbitrate or decide between us. And so I thought this was nonsense, and this Treasury organization is going much too far. So when I went into the Treasury, I asked if I could have with me as my Assistant Secretary for International Affairs a man who had been my top assistant on that in the State Department, a man by the name of John Leddy, later Ambassador Leddy. Yes.
How do you spell it?
Leddy. And he came over to the Treasury and served for a couple of years in that capacity. And I found that when the Treasury bureaucracy there, they were very capable people. When they realized that they weren't expected to do this, they just stopped doing it. And so, therefore, all this sort of bickering that had been going on ceased, which meant there was much less relationships. So the relationships having been bad, that was gotten away with. So the relationships were good, but we were just in different fields. Now, the only places we did have differences of opinion were sometimes on some of the monetary things we were doing, and those never had to do with your father, because they were handled in the State Department.
He didn't get involved with those financial questions.
Entirely by George Ball.
That's right. I get the impression.
And we had a number of times, including once when we had to go to the President Kennedy in a great big meeting where George Ball was complaining about something we were doing. But that was, those were the only relationship, and your father never took any part in. I don't think he even came to meet him.
I gather he really didn't have either the background or the interest in financial matters, deferred heavily to George Ball.
That's right.
And others in the department.
Yeah, to George Ball at that time. So that was, and of course also, the State Department sort of got out of the aid business. So, because when George Ball got there, he thought that was too much trouble, and he wanted to be working on what he considered bigger policy matters. So they made the aid agency much more independent than it had been during the years when I was there. It was independent, but it was under the supervision of the Undersecretary of State. And we spent a good deal of time doing that. And so they didn't. So whatever argumentation there might have been was what would have been with the aid agency.
Mm-hmm. You said my dad did provide leadership within the cabinet as a whole.
Very much so. When we went off on meetings of cabinet members to Canada a couple of times, and we were going to Japan when the assassination took place.
You were on that plane?
Yeah.
That's right.
And
That's right.
when in the various protocol, whatever there were, meetings when the cabinet was together, functioning as a cabinet, he clearly assumed and carried out the functions of the Secretary of State, which is the leader of the cabinet. And everybody was glad to follow.
Some of his critics have suggested that he was a very private and reticent man, and it was difficult for his colleagues to know what was in his mind. Did you have that problem with my father?
No, because that was in would have been the State Department. That may have been what I talked about here in these NSC meetings, where I did have the impression that compared to some other people's willingness to stake out positions, that he was generally rather reserved. Now, I wouldn't know. He may have talked to the president privately, because that's always the thing. He just not wanted to say something in front of a group. And sometimes people do that, and sometimes that's the way it works best. So I don't know about that. But if that came up in any way, that if I noticed it in any way, it was only there. I never noticed it in these broad cabinet meetings or things of that nature.
I've got a question about Nkrumah of Ghana, and apparently President Kennedy made a commitment of sorts for aid on the Volta Dam project. This must have been in 1961 or 62. And Nkrumah later, and at the time, began to side up with the Soviet bloc, and I believe his alignment or his allegiances may have been shifting. It created some confusion within the administration. Some folks wanted to back away from the project, and I think John Kennedy eventually did go ahead and fund it. Do you recall this particular policy issue?
I recall Nkrumah being a difficult person, but that's all. I don't think we in the Treasury had anything to do with it. The president that was one thing. Until Cuban Missile Crisis, he wanted to, he made it very clear that he was, looked to me for financial advice and Treasury advice, but nothing to do with my past history in the State Department. He never talked to me about foreign policy or anything.
John Kennedy never discussed it.
And I think that was right, because he had his own advisor there, but it was a very clear line. I think in one instance it was a serious mistake, but which I'll expand on a little later. But general, I think it was right. He did ask me to do one thing, I guess two things. I went to Brazil for some, that was an economic meeting, really. And then he put me in charge of the Punta del Este first negotiations regarding the Alliance for Progress.
Right.
That's because I've been really so close to it before, and also the Treasury had a deep interest because of many establishing the new Inter-American Bank and various other things. He knew I had it just like this, and I don't think George Bull wanted to do it anyway. So he asked me to do that. That was the one exception. The place where I think he made a mistake and things might have been a little better was in regard to the Bay of Pigs operation, where I was the official in the State Department for the last top official in the State Department for the last year of the administration who was in charge of the State Department interests in these preparations.
Yeah.
So I knew everything that was going on up till the 1st of January when I left the State Department. I knew that what the basic plans were, and the President never mentioned it to me or asked me anything about it. And the first thing I knew about it was I was going down to Brazil for this economic meeting. I went to say goodbye, and he told me when I was there that the operation was going to begin while I was down there, so we didn't know about it.
Huh.
And,
never consulted with you on it, though.
Never.
Yeah.
And I think I might have been able to have thrown some light on that might have helped. The reason I think that is that one of the things the President did, which is part of this whole thing, led to this, what I consider error, was that he dismantled, as soon as he got into office, the rather complex organization that had been set up to handle the National Security Council, and decided he wanted to handle it in a much more informal way.
Task group type of way.
Yeah, now you can do that. But, I mean, any president can handle it any way he wants. But the unfortunate timing of the thing was that it broke all the channels of communication that existed before, and there wasn't really time to develop new channels that were tested and complete. And as a result, the president became clear, was not aware of one of the, I consider, important things in the plan, which was that if the airstrikes were unsuccessful, as there was a good chance they wouldn't be with these old B-26 bombers, that Navy planes would provide air cover as necessary for the landing. And first he heard about it was when someone came to him and said, "Now it's the time to order the air cover." And he said, "What air cover?" And blew up and said, "Not on your life." And the whole thing fell apart. And he took entire responsibility.
Yeah.
Well,
I guess everyone learned quite a few lessons.
Everything learned a lot. I don't know why he didn't know that. Under the other system, he would have known it. The earlier system, because everybody would have been in there, but it had to have been told.
Yeah.
But here it was, presumably, he was talking to too few people, and whoever he talked to didn't tell everything, so no one told him.
My dad said even the memos and the position papers and everything picked up at the end of every meeting.
Yeah.
So they didn't even have, the senior fellows couldn't even take these home with them and study them.
So somehow the security was excellent, but
Didn't do any good, huh?
It made this one big mistake. I think if he'd known that was there, he would have said no. And if he'd said no, I don't know whether the others would have wanted to go ahead.
You yourself didn't have any involvement with the policy as it unfolded during Kennedy, or any contacts with my dad on the band papers?
Never. I just had it up till whatever it was, end of December when I resigned from the State Department.
Get it back to
that was the end, so I never talked about it at all. I was, the only time I was with your father on where foreign policy was discussed was, I'd say a day or two before the inauguration, it was 3 days before or a week before, whatever it was, when we had a meeting with President Eisenhower, and Senator Kennedy went there, and there was, Secretary Gates was there, and Herter was there, and I'm not sure, I guess maybe Bob Anderson was there from Eisenhower administration, and there was McNamara and your father, and I was there, and I don't know whether Bundy may have been there or may not, I don't know. And, but that talk was mostly about Laos. And they didn't mention, as I recall, the Cuban thing.
Yeah. You were heavily involved with the Alliance for Progress.
But on the Cuban thing,
Yeah.
Eisenhower was always very strong, and even in his own mind very strong, that this was not something that was decided to go ahead, that this was just an option.
Oh, I see.
And he was only to be decided finally when all the facts and things were in, and he really wanted more assurance than he ever got. Anyone could give him that there'd be some support for it in Cuba.
Yeah. My dad has said that his major regret about his role in the Bay of Pigs was not asking the Joint Chiefs of Staff to prepare their list of requirements for an American operation for that similar setting.
Yeah.
And he said that when the Joint Chief had come back with their list, Kennedy would have noticed the disparity between the Joint Chiefs' American plan and what was planned by these Cuban exiles, and immediately saw the futility of it.
Yeah, that's right.
You were involved with the Alliance for Progress, and I'm curious as to my dad's role with that affair. You were there with John Kennedy in August of '61 at the first meeting at Punta del Este.
Yeah, I was at Punta del Este. I was in charge of the delegation. I was there for 3 weeks.
You were not at the second meeting where my dad
No.
made such a good performance.
It was just the first one where we got started, and that was done. And the president, when he asked me to go to this first one, said this was exceptional, and would I do this because I'd had all the background on it up to that time. And they were busily engaged in some sort of a rather major argument with the Russians and Germany at that moment.
The Department of State was.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
Right, Berlin.
That's what I mean was all going on.
So you went more or less in my dad's behalf. Because
I did the whole thing, and I don't know, there probably was someone there. There were some people there from the State Department, but I've forgotten exactly who went, but they worked with me, and there was no problem.
Yeah, you don't recall any contacts with my dad on the Alliance
No,
or any awareness of his role in the thing. Okay. Let me ask you this. Well, you're interested in your early views on the Vietnam War, and apparently you argued from the beginning during the Kennedy years that Southeast Asia was peripheral to American interests, and yours must have been a lonely voice back in those years. Let me ask you another question. Didn't think
it was really peripheral, as much as that I knew that the strong feeling that President Eisenhower had against getting involved on the mainland of Asia. It just was too far away and just almost impossible to handle it. That, coupled with his feeling that you should never get involved in the use of force unless you were prepared to go all the way, because it wasn't something you played with. And it seemed perfectly clear that nobody was prepared to do that. So therefore, don't. That was sort of my thinking.
I understand that President Eisenhower's advice to John Kennedy on the eve of the inauguration included the statement that Laos must be defended.
Yeah, Laos he felt quite strong about, but his idea, if you did this, was that you'd do it.
Yeah.
And you'd send in very substantial forces. Of course, it's a bit ambivalent because he did feel that way, but earlier in the 50s, he'd had the opposite reaction.
That's true.
And
he kept us out back in
kept us out when Dulles wanted to do something.
Did the cabinet as a body ever consider the Vietnam War? the big questions. Should we get involved?
Right.
They never did. You don't recall?
Well, no, the cabinet never considered anything in the Kennedy years, and I don't think that there was any real consideration of anything by an expanded Security Council, except till the time of the ex-con. But the missile crisis. But they did have these these regular Monday lunches or whatever they were. I never went to one of them, but where the president and your father and McNamara and I don't know who else, Bundy, I guess, and maybe a fellow from the CIA or something like that, met and talked, and that was the Security Council.
Tuesday lunches under the Johnson years.
Yeah, I'm
okay.
saying those were that took the place of what had been the Security Council in the Eisenhower years, which was a bigger, more formalized thing, but it had the same function. It was a weekly meeting to discuss the major problems of the president.
I'm quite interested in the Vietnam War. I was a student at Cornell in the...
The first time it became a war was the meeting I mentioned in that letter, which was, I think, in late February, when we, for the first time, sent a couple of planes to bomb a bridge just across the border in North Vietnam. And that was, I've forgotten the name of the camp, but it was a well-known occasion when the Viet Cong or North Vietnamese, whoever they were, attacked this camp and killed some Americans.
Pleiku, was it?
So I think that was it.
Pleiku, yeah.
And got everybody excited. And they felt they had to answer in some fashion. Well, that's where I, with Johnson at least, sort of fell off the wagon because I felt if they were going to start doing this, they ought to go all the way. But there was always a feeling, I don't know how real it was, but I had the feeling that others in the state, and particularly the Defense Department, were afraid of the Soviet reaction. And I wasn't at all, because I don't know if my dealings with the Soviet, they were, at least at that time, they were very practical people, and if you took a really strong position, unless it was right up against their front door where they could do something about it, they weren't going to do anything about it. And so I felt that if they were going to go after North Vietnam, they ought to be prepared to move right in and blockade Haiphong before all the equipment got in there and everything else happened. And I think that, I don't know what would have come out, but I think there's a possibility they could have, North Vietnamese would have backed down, the whole thing would have been called off for a while. I don't know what would happen later on, which I couldn't stay there forever, obviously.
Yeah. My dad's only real regret
was policy. And McNamara had this idea, which I think was just dead wrong, that you use military force in little doses.
My dad was very much a proponent of that, too. That was his strategy as well, and he was always for cutting back on the military's requests. He wanted to prevent the Americanization of the war, not bomb North Vietnam. I think a lot of this ties back to his Korean experience when he didn't anticipate, with his other colleagues, the intervention of the Chinese. It just shocked the hell out of him. Really made a mess out of that particular country.
Yeah, sure. It was going quite well. Of course, maybe you had Chinese intervention here if you'd gone too far, but there wasn't much they could do if you... I was thinking more of naval action, which was blockade, which would have been quite effective in the beginning, but it was at the end, and we did it finally, and nothing happened, but it would have been much easier early on.
Would one of the reasons have been for not having discussed it with my dad, perhaps the appearance of on his part of a reticence to discuss this thing that we were signed on for the...
So it wasn't. I always felt I was in the Treasury Department. It wasn't my business.
Yeah,
and I didn't want to get into this except if I was asked. And the only reason I did was at that
That's a question of some significance there. We're discussing Vietnam decision-making, and Mr. Dillon has said that the only time you were asked for your opinion on the war was this 1965 meeting of the National Security Council.
Well, as I was saying,
I
President Johnson did not use the National Security Council, at least at that time, for the purpose of policy discussions or decisions. He had made those decisions in earlier discussions with the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and whoever he talked with about those matters. And he only had the National Security Council when he wanted a record made, a public record made of that he had consulted the Security Council and that they'd agreed on something, so it wasn't just himself. So at this meeting he had, and he asked me to come to it as Secretary of the Treasury because I guess he had quite a big, the whole table was full of people. Looked like the Security Council meetings under President Eisenhower. And he wanted to have the decision, which I'm sure he'd already made, validated to have these two planes go and do this bombing in response to play coup. And it was announced in the paper that there had been a Security Council meeting and they decided all this. So someone more or less, I suppose McNamara or your father, or both, outlined what was proposed or being done, and the president indicated that was okay, and then he said, now I want to go around the table, what do you think, what do you think? I didn't want everybody to say, aye. I was the only one that raised any questions.
Oh, really? The only one in the group?
Yeah, and so he wasn't really asking for what we should do, but just what do you think about this, you see, and I raised this question, just as I thought that they shouldn't do it unless they were prepared to move rather rapidly, full scale. And he said, of course we are. And of course they weren't. And but that was the only time.
Although you were part of the group that were called in the aftermath of the Tet Offensive.
That was later. That was the wise man. That was a totally different thing.
Yeah.
And
do you recall my dad's having any particular role in that meeting? I'm sure he was listening more than.
I think so. I don't think we were there, and the fellow that had the biggest role, I guess, was Clark Clifford in sort of getting it going, and he must have produced witnesses that came before us the night before, and while at earlier meetings we had all been rather strong because we had reputations, most of us, as what they called hogs. And when this time came and he produced some general there that had been out there who I asked the question that night, what if we do send these extra 200,000 men or whatever it was they wanted, how long will this go on? Will this end it? And the fellow said no. And I said, well, how long will we go? He said 5 years, 10 years. I threw up our hands and everybody else did. And so that's when people like myself and Dean Acheson, who were all very hard-liners, just switched right around because you couldn't do this. We got in and told the president that the next morning, nearly knocked him off his chair when we said this, and we wanted to know why. And we told him it was this general, and he said, well, I never heard anything like that. He turned right around and said, I want to see that general 3 o'clock this afternoon. Right away. Get him over here.
He did.
I don't know what happened to the poor general.
What happened to the,
2 weeks later, Johnson quit.
Yeah.
I mean, it was that much of a shock.
Very dramatic period. Lucius Battle was in the car outside waiting for Dean Acheson. He came out of that meeting, and Atchison told him that he had just advised President Johnson to begin withdrawing from Vietnam. Battle 17. My God, you know. So this kind of reversal.
Yeah.
What an important thing. What an important meeting that was. I'm
Oh.
sure that played a major
Well,
role.
that's the reason he quit.
Yeah.
But then I guess that coupled with when he got this general over, and the fellow told him, had to tell him the same thing.
Yeah.
And then he realized because he hadn't been told.
Clifford picked the briefers? Who?
Sure.
He probably did.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
defense by that, because the background now is that we didn't know at the time was that Clifford, by this time, had come to the same conclusion. They didn't dare tell the president himself, so
Yeah.
did it this way.
Yeah. You don't have any particular insights on my dad's role during that policy evaluation after the 10th?
No, I don't know what happened.
Yeah. Okay. I want to ask you a question about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you were on the ExComm committee, and initially I believe you were an advocate of the airstrike with NITSE and the Joint Chiefs. Then the thing began to swing around, and you looked hard at the whole group looked hard at the quarantine and the blockade, and then there was a shift back. I think it might have been the influence of the Joint Chiefs or a military influence began to waver on that, and the consensus began to drift apart. And my dad apparently stepped in there and kind of nailed things back together again, according to one count. Do you recall any of that?
Not particularly. What I remember is a rather dramatic meeting in the State Department. So we were arguing this. I'm not sure whether your father was there at that moment or not. When Bob Kennedy got up and made a very dramatic comparison of that and Pearl Harbor. I said,
That's
we
right.
can't do it.
I don't
And
want
that's
my
what-
brother to be the Tojo of the 1960s.
Yeah, well, whatever. But I mean, it's
Yeah.
just that comparison.
Yeah.
And it that struck home, and that's what changed me. And I think a lot of other people.
Bobby Kennedy's forceful advocacy.
And that comparison.
I see. Mm-hmm.
And it would be looked at like that.
Mhm.
So it made me think that switch over that, not that we shouldn't necessarily do it at some later time, but that we
Wasn't the way
should
to
do
start.
everything else first
Yeah.
instead of doing that right along. And what I don't know about this business of falling back. The quarantine worked to a point. Ships stopped, but the work apparently didn't stop.
That's
on
right.
the installation, and we were pushing very hard, and we were mobilizing at the same time so that we could launch an invasion. And I think that there was a majority, probably a pretty strong majority on ExComm in favor of an invasion if the Russians did not back down. And
Withdraw their stuff.
I think that, or stop the work and say they do it. And that the Bobby Kennedy was having these negotiations, which none of us knew too much about, but we knew he was having them with the Greenland. And whatever he told him, no one will ever know.
Yeah.
But he certainly could have told him that there were a limited number of hours left.
Yeah. Any awareness or
something like that,
Yeah.
and all they had to do was to see the number of ships that were coming into Charleston, the number of people
Right.
that were getting there, and the number of airplane squadrons that were shifted down
Yeah.
to know that we would have had the capability ready to go. And my feeling, never know, but my feeling was that if the Russians hadn't stopped on Sunday, we would have been landing by
Yeah.
Tuesday or Wednesday.
Yeah. Do you recall what my dad's role was? Any significant recollections of on your part after all these years about my dad's particular performance during that episode?
Well, I think he was rather, I think at that time, in the meetings with the big meetings of the group with the president, I think I had the feeling that he did not express himself quite as much as some of the rest of us.
I see.
As McNamara or Atchison, it's even myself from time to time, but I think he generally was, I had the impression, was in favor of doing what we did.
Yeah.
Not going too fast, and he was very clearly against any sort of an airstrike in the beginning.
Yeah.
And as the thing progressed, I think we were fairly much of all together, except for Adlai Stevenson, who was the only one who was the complete sort of soft thing that would agree to publicly to withdraw all these missiles from Turkey.
Yeah, right.
Everything else is a deal, and nobody else would do that. Although again, I have strong suspicion that Albert Kennedy told the Greenan that they'd be withdrawn if they did the other, but that was all
quietly
right.
and after the fact.
That was a different thing.
Yeah. Just a couple more questions, and then I'm done. Curious what you might have known about my father's relationship with Lyndon Johnson. I understand that, and perhaps you could use your own as an illustration of it. Johnson was supposed to have been a very dynamic person, occasionally very hard to work for, occasionally abusive with certainly his personal staff. Did that ever enter into his relationships with senior staff? Would he have been, you weren't aware of any of this abusive treatment towards...
He wasn't with me, and I never saw him be with your father or whoever else I'd seen him.
That was more of a personal staff...
I think it was more of that, although I think we were aware that that was probably his nature, but not with us. I had a sort of a special relationship with him because I had a bit of a run-in with him right away at the beginning. And since he felt very strongly he didn't want anybody to leave him, particularly to stay through the election, he had to back down. And I don't think he liked that very much. And as a result, he told me that I could run the treasury department, he could run the government.
Oh, that was the outshot of that, huh?
So,
well, good for you.
He never would help me on the Hill or anything with any legislation he wanted. He said, that's your affair.
Okay. Well, that must have been a nice arrangement in a way.
Well, it made it perfectly easy. We weren't, I mean, I'd been very close with President Kennedy, extremely close, and I didn't have that sort of relationship with Johnson, although I think he thought I did it all right, and it was useful to him, but he liked to run everything, and so to feel he had control of everything, so it was in January, the Treasury always, every quarter, sells some long-term bonds, and the president has to, by law, 150-year-old law, has to sign a paper every time you sell a bond over 5 years or something like that. And we send it over for his signature, and the president automatically signed it. Well, the first time that happened to Johnson was the end of January for the February thing. And I got a call from Walter Heller saying the president referred this thing to him. It's in the afternoon. And he wondered about what we were doing. It was, they thought the interest rate was a little too high or something like that.
Yeah.
I said, I'm sorry, Walter, that's it. And he said, well, the president, as long as you tell the president, but if I don't get that thing signed, my resignation's on his desk at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.
So,
And Walter Heller, "Woo-hoo, you told me that, you told me that." And I said, yes, I do. Sorry, Walter, bye-bye. That night we had, there was a big meeting, a big affair at the White House. It was a reception for the judiciary. And everybody was there, and in the middle of it, Johnson was there, and I saw him with Walter Heller. I said, come up and say hello. He said, what is it you want me to do about this thing? I said, sign that piece of paper. So he took out the punch stamp.
that's funny. That is funny, yeah.
And then he told me this, that you run the treasury.
You run the treasury, I'll run the government.
Yeah.
I'll be darned. That's interesting.
That's why I don't know what the relationships were in other places, but
Yeah.
he just wanted to assert his authority, really. I don't think he was interested a damn bit of whether the interest rate was this or that.
Yeah.
But,
If you were close friends with John Kennedy, maybe you can help me here. And my dad has said that only two people know their true relationship, and one of them is dead. The other one is not talking. And I found that to be the case with my father too. He regards that as a very privileged area, and he won't discuss it with me. Were you privy at all to John Kennedy's feelings about my dad, or aware of their relationship at all? I remember in your letter you referred briefly
that's the only
to
thing.
a point.
I heard him, I'd say once, or
One
maybe
time?
twice, mention this thing that he was having difficulty with, sort of saying he's sort of slightly exasperated thing. Why do they keep sending
Me these things.
these things? Yeah. And
You don't recall what they were?
No. Oh, I wasn't told what they were.
Yeah.
It was just something.
Yeah.
It was in the midst of talking about something else, and someone came to this, and sort of a reaction like that. That was the only thing I know. Was what I said. I think it was very clear because the president made that clear that he was going to spend more time, wanted to spend more time on domestic matters.
Right.
Leading up to the election,
Right.
maybe after. And I think the foreign things seemed like a great, interesting thing and a challenge. But after he'd been doing it that way for a couple of years,
He lost his interest.
it was just took a lot of time.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of other things, so I think he wanted to ease down a bit. And of course, he demanded this sort of, wanted this sort of arrangement when he started, and it's awful hard to change that. And
Right.
if you like to see it, difficult for your father. The president wanted everything like this. Suddenly you say, well, now I don't want things except ones that are really important. Well,
Yeah.
how do you decide? I mean,
Yeah.
it's not an easy thing.
Yeah. You spoke earlier about during the Eisenhower years there was a great deal of collaboration between the Treasury Department and the State Department.
Not collaboration.
It bordered
yeah.
on interference.
Yeah.
And you put a halt to it.
Yeah.
Did that have the practical consequence of injecting lack of coordination into State Department foreign policies that had fiscal questions attached to it? Did it have negative effects on policy?
No, I don't think
You
so.
don't think so?
Because really what it was on the details largely of aid programs
I
and
see.
things of that nature.
Just
Whether we
superficial.
gave, we'd come up in the Eisenhower days and want to give $2 million to Mali because it was they're having a famine.
Yeah.
And the Treasury would say, no, you can only give them $1.25 million. I mean, what's the difference? But it's, even though the figures then were bigger, but
Yeah.
because $2 million was a lot more valuable then than now. But nevertheless, it was really very small potatoes. And I remember literally going to the president with Bob Anderson on the thing, just no bigger than that.
Yeah.
It was silly. And that's what I got rid of.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
might have cost us $20 million that we didn't have to spend over a period of a couple of years or
Yeah.
something,
Mhm.
but whatever.
A lot less
Yeah,
hassle.
A lot less
Yeah.
hassle and a lot clearer policy.
Mhm. I remember clearly your remarks about my mother and my father at the February birthday party. That was a very gracious speech. Very nice.
Your mother was the most active and one of the best wives of the Secretary of State in what she did and the way she carried out her duties of any lawns
Hmm. Interesting. Mhm. I've had people tell me I should be writing my book about her.
She's very good at it. She worked hard at it.
Yeah, she did. She really did. And I think, any contacts with my dad after you left the administration? Anything of consequence during all these years?
He's been down there and I've been up here. I've been interested in museums and he's kept his interest in foreign policy, which I do, but only peripherally.
Yeah.
Go to the council at times, but it's
I think that'll do it.
thank you. Just
And,
fits with me.